Welcome, everybody. I'm Rick Grove. I'm the CEO of Rudder Associates, a quantitative finance risk management firm that's headquartered in this building here in New York. But tonight, it's my privilege to host as a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and president of the board of the US Friends of the IISS. Many of you here are members of the IISS, but for those of you who are attending for the first time, let me just briefly introduce the Institute to you. We are a not-for-profit, global, nonpartisan think tank based in London with offices in the US, in Washington, in Singapore, and in the Middle East. And we're a world-leading authority on strategic and security issues. Very well known for our publications, including the Military Balance, Strategic Survey, and also very well known for our convening power, the ability to bring world leaders together in dialogues, multilateral and bilateral dialogues, most notably the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which takes place annually in June, and the Manama Dialogue that takes place this year in November in Manama, Bahrain. I expect I will be at that meeting. I think it'll be very interesting as an American to be attending that meeting in the wake of recent developments. In fact, I'm not looking forward to it as much as I have been in previous years. But nevertheless, it's an important meeting. But that's not the subject of tonight's discussion. You can be sure that we will come back to the Middle East. We've had discussions on the Iran nuclear agreement recently. We have had discussions about Syria in the past. And you can be sure that down the road we'll come back to the Middle East. But tonight we're going to be talking about Brexit. And in particular, Brexit and the implications of Brexit going forward for the UK and for the transatlantic relationship. The referendum that took place in 2016, in June of 2016, the result caught not everybody, but many of us by surprise. I don't think anybody could have foreseen the political chaos that ensued in the UK over the past 3 years, continuing right up to this evening. For those of you who didn't see the news today, there were two votes in the House of Commons. There was a vote on the second reading of the implementation bill, which is a procedural vote, and that vote carried 329 to 299, and it carried because some 19 Labour MPs crossed over to vote with the government on that bill. But it doesn't in and of itself have any significance. It's not the final passage of the bill. What was more significant today was the procedural bill, the timetable bill that the government had put forward, and on that one they lost by 14 votes. With fewer of the Labour MPs crossing over and a number of the independent, formerly Conservative MPs who had voted for the second reading of the implementation bill, some of them voting against the government. And so that leaves the government, I'm not sure where. I'm hoping our speaker will clarify everything for us this evening. But there's a lot of discussion about, extension, whether it's January 31st, which is a date that's being kicked around in Brussels right now, apparently, although I've heard out of number 10, Downing Street, November 15th, an attempt to continue to have the UK facing the cliff edge. We are delighted tonight to have as our speaker Bill Emmott. Bill is the former editor-in-chief of The Economist. Many of you know his work of many years at The Economist. And Bill is also chairman of the board of trustees of the IISS. So we are doubly proud to have Bill with us this evening. Bill is doing a number of things in academia in particular now. He serves on the board of directors of Tokyo University. He has a considerable amount of expertise in Japan, having covered Japan for The Economist in the past. And I believe also you speak Japanese. Am I right about that?
Skoshi deke.
Okay, I thought so. And Bill has some interesting books out right now, one of which in English, if you want to look it up, is The Fate of the West, The Battle to Save the World's Most Successful Political Idea. We may come back to that tonight. And the Japanese work, which I think is particularly interesting, but it's in Japanese, Japan's Far More Female Future. So I think that's quite interesting. We will be on the record tonight. Two housekeeping notes before I hand the microphone over to Bill. One, Bill will speak for 20 minutes or so, and then we will have a period of time for Q&A. We may not get to all the questions tonight. I have a feeling we may not tonight, but Bill can stick around afterwards. We will end at 7:30, but Bill's able to stick around a bit afterwards. I also want to mention that we're going to be having an event on November 5th, jointly sponsored by the IISS and the Kaplan Foundation. It's going to be here in this room. If you're interested in that event, it's going to be 5 serving U.S. military officers who are now fellows at the Council on Foreign Relations, and they're going to be talking about the state of the U.S. military. And so if you're interested in that, see Lee Sloan in the back, and she'll make sure that that you get an invitation to that event. Okay, without further ado, let me turn it over to Bill.
Well, thank you, Rick. I think I'll stand up just so that I can see people at the back. I hope I'm still able to be heard by the recording device that's on the table, I should ask.
And is your mic on?
Is my mic on? That's a good question. My voice is on, but not my mic.
I think it is now.
That seems better. Yes, okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Rick, and thank you all for being here, for your support for the IISS. Of which I have the privilege of chairing the trustees. I've been a trustee for quite a number of years, about 7 years now. So I've seen the Institute grow and flourish, and it's very, very financially strong and intellectually strong. So it's a delight to bask in its glory as a chairman of the trustees. That isn't a phrase, bask in glory, that I use for Brexit. Brexit has been a kind of shambles over 3 years of similar nature to a similar kind of spirit that was said by a British historian in the 19th century about the British Empire, that we had built an empire in a fit of absence of mind. Donald Tusk, the former Polish president and president of the European Council, had a slightly different version that actually borrowed from John F. Kennedy, one of his speeches, in which he said that there was a special place in hell reserved for those who campaigned for Brexit without a plan about how to execute it. And that's where Britain has been for 3 years, basically going round and round in what could be described as an eternal Groundhog Day, or perhaps at times resembled a circular firing squad. But basically going around trying to constantly avoid coming to a conclusion. So I'll come back to why and what it means, but let's get straight down to the news. Does today's developments, do the current developments in London mean that we are finally reaching a conclusion, or is it going to be dragged out for even longer? My view on that is that basically now we are reaching a conclusion. It's not a conclusion I agree with, but it is basically the end of the beginning of the Brexit process. The political forces are now aligned to make Brexit definitely happen. The opposition to Brexit has proven too divided, and in the end probably not passionate enough to change things over the last 3 years, and there is a prevailing feeling that basically we need to move on in a certain way and get on with other things. The Conservative Party, which of course gave rise to Brexit really after the debacle of the 2008 financial crisis, then difficult political situation in 2010, 2011, 2012, when a rise of anti-European forces came on the right of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party were those who have that special place in hell reserved for them by Donald Trump. But then they made it even worse, another circle of Dante's Inferno, when they essentially lost a general election in 2017 and lost their parliamentary majority, which made it impossible to get agreement on what is a process in which you need to make very difficult choices between essentially incompatible objectives. So then along comes Mr. Alexander Boris de Pfeffel Johnson, elected as new Conservative leader in July, and he has got to the point of this end of the beginning. What do you want to know about Boris Johnson? The Johnson family are a family of politicians and writers. Boris's father was a bureaucrat working for the European Commission, then became a member of the European Parliament, is an environmental campaigner, and is a writer and novelist. Boris's sister, Rachel, is a novelist and columnist on the Daily Mail and other publications, now the Sunday Times. Boris's brother, Joe, is a politician, former Financial Times journalist. This is a family that has been likened by themselves to be Britain's version of a combination of the Kennedys and the Kardashians. So why choose Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister? The answer is that this was the Conservative Party's last gamble. He was Foreign Secretary for 18 months under Theresa May and was actually almost universally believed to have been a failure as Foreign Secretary. Not taken seriously, he made some very serious errors, but he has one important characteristic from the point of view of the Conservative Party, which is that he is clearly a good campaigner and communicator. The Conservative Party this year has been running scared of there being an election, running scared of basically being punished by the voters for a failure to come up to a conclusion on Brexit. So choosing Boris as their leader was essentially their last throw of the dice. And Boris has performed in basically the way that those of us who followed this man over the years could easily have predicted, and indeed did. Namely, he made a lot of promises during the leadership election in June and July for the Conservative Party, and within weeks he has broken them and betrayed many of his previous supporters, mainly those supporters in Northern Ireland. So what is the solution? Well, his solution is actually the only possible resolution, really, of the Brexit conundrum, which is to treat Northern Ireland as a special economic zone, keeping it de facto inside the European Union so as to preserve its economic relationship with the Republic of Ireland and avoid having a formal set of border infrastructure which could lead to a resumption of violence between the nationalist and the unionist communities, between the IRA and the Ulster Defence Forces on either side of the Northern Ireland conflict. He swore blind that he would not do this. He said no British Prime Minister could accept a border de facto down the Irish Sea, in other words, a different economic arrangement between the North and the South, and within weeks he broke his own promise. This is a triumphant decision because that is why he won the vote in the House of Commons today and why his version of Brexit will prevail, because he has formed a political coalition behind this version of Brexit. The decision that went against him today was about the timetable in the House of Commons. And my view is that that's less important to him. This is a vote to say, no, we're not going to rush through this complex piece of legislation in a matter of days in order to meet your self-imposed deadline of October the 31st, but rather we are going to be a responsible Parliament giving this legislation proper attention and go through it more line by line. That's a perfectly sane and reasonable position to take, but behind it, the political forces still are to actually get this through, and I think it will still be passed. My guess is that there will be a short extension of our deadline, and we will be into the next phase of Brexit by the middle of November or the latest, the beginning of December. That process means that we wouldn't have an immediate general election. But if we did, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party would almost certainly win it. One reason is that the main opposition is led by a former Marxist well, possibly a present Marxist, Jeremy Corbyn, who basically has spent his entire career as a sort of pacifist agitprop campaigner, never with any serious coherent policy. He became leader of the Labour Party in part of the post-crash disarray and because of a loss of faith with the alternatives, and he's been a disastrously weak leader of the Labour Party. So I think the opposition is weak, and basically Johnson will prevail. So we are in a case where Britain is leaving the European Union essentially by virtue of the Prime Minister having, in effect, sounded the retreat and managing to call it victory by his way through. He is described, and he self-identifies, Boris Johnson, as an admirer of someone you've heard of called Donald Trump. In that he thinks that the right way to negotiate is to go in hard, as he puts it. Actually, in my view, he has indeed followed very much the Trump playbook in his diplomatic deal-making. In other words, he's gone in hard and then lost, essentially, most of the argument. But that's because he's conceded most of the argument, and his tough position was essentially all posturing. Where will it leave us? Where will it matter for Britain that this kind of Brexit is going to happen, and what is it going to do to transatlantic relations? That's really the most serious part of this discussion. Part of the issue is that we are a country now led by a member of the Kardashian-Kennedy dynasty, who is not really a very serious prime minister, but who is surrounded by people who are a bit better than that. But another part of the answer is that much of the negotiation happens from now on. What we have finally resolved after 3 years of going round and round is the terms of our divorce, the withdrawal agreement from the European Union. The next thing we have to resolve is the terms of our future relationship with our European neighbours, in trade, in investment rules, in security and defence, in intelligence sharing, in all sorts of legal issues. So that's going to be a long process. We will, because this withdrawal agreement, divorce agreement has been agreed, we will have a transition period of around 2 years during which the old laws will continue to apply. We will still be de facto part of the European Union for that 2 years, while we don't have any say in any of the rules, but we will be negotiating our future relationship. What if the Conservative Party continues to govern Britain, which I think it will, and the Johnson administration continues to survive? I think Britain will move into a relatively deregulatory, possibly tax-cutting period of economic policy. If there's a rationale for Brexit, it has to be to do something different from what you were doing as a member of the European Union. There's only a few tools that you have extra. One is trade policy, your tariff policy. Second is regulatory policy, your own regulations relative to European regulations in all sorts of sectors. Third is perhaps a more aggressive use of fiscal policy than you might have felt comfortable with doing, even if you weren't formally prevented. So I think that we will diverge. We will have Northern Ireland being much closer to the European Union, but the rest of Britain, Scotland, England and Wales diverging, probably with some quite aggressive deregulation, rather like in America in the last 2+ years, particularly in environmental areas and particularly regulation of the bioscience industry, of genetic engineering and that sort of thing, and perhaps some other areas that I don't know about. So we will go through a period of divergence. which will, I think, then lead to some difficulty in our negotiating relationship with the European Union, because the more we diverge, the harder the negotiation about how to put a framework, a legal and treaty framework around that divergence. We will also be seeking to make our own trade agreements with other countries. Obviously the United States, Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand, but then a lot of other trade arrangements. Again, how different those will be will depend upon the base negotiation with the European Union, but probably there will be a push to try to make them more liberal, more free trading relationships than the prevailing European Union policy has been, although European Union is a pretty free trading place by global standards. So that's the direction we're going to go in, assuming that we do get the political outcome that I think is going to happen. The restoration of a working majority for the Conservative Party in Parliament, a 5-year horizon for that relatively right-wing version of the Conservative Party, that will move it in that direction. But what matters for transatlantic relations is probably more security and defence policy. And that's where the British ambiguity and tension is highest. There's a great spirit of wishing to be free and more kind of innovative in their own ways in trade and regulatory policy, sometimes in a delusional way, sometimes in a real way. But in security and defense, there's a certain geographical reality that rules. Our main security issues are in the European neighbourhood, not only, but substantially within the European neighbourhood. One of our principal sources of intelligence cooperation is, of course, the United States, but also important is intelligence cooperation with other European countries. How do we preserve that after Brexit? Probably the most worrying thing for non-political commentators, analysts like me, but nevertheless patriotic Englishmen, in the last 3 years has been the worry that through the poisoning of our relationship with our European partners, former European partners, with the damaging of our credibility as we have stumbled from lack of decision to lack of decision and shown ourselves to be unable to, if you like, reach the end of this process, we might thereby have created irreparable damage to our security and defense and intelligence sharing relationships with these critical geographical partners. So I think what's going to happen over the next period is that as we negotiate the future trade and technology relationship and regulatory relationship with the European Union, sometimes with some quite tense negotiations, there's pretty likely to be a big effort to try to restore defense, security and intelligence relationships with our European partners. The idea that we are in some kind of a binary relationship either with the United States or with Europe is just nonsense. We have to be with both as the United Kingdom, and we have to re-establish a close cooperative relationship. Even during the very short Johnson administration, we have seen on some key foreign policy issues that actually even he, who has professed to be very sympathetic to the Trump administration, even he has stuck pretty close to European positions on issues such as Iran, for example, and resisted the temptation to simply flip to a more Trump position. I think that that's telling us something about what the future will also likely hold, that actually British policy will be more often than not quite aligned with our European partners. I think the big shame for transatlantic relations out of Brexit is that while Britain was always a semi-detached member of the European Union and one with unusually close relationships in defense and intelligence matters and diplomacy with the United States, it was also in many ways a friendly agent of good transatlantic relations between the US and Europe. We all know that transatlantic relations have often been up and down. During my time as editor of The Economist, I think probably I ran covers symbolizing some sort of schism in transatlantic relationships. Probably in my 13 years, I reckon there were probably 4 or 5 times in that time that I said, oh God, is this the end of the transatlantic relationship? And the answer is it was a bad phase. And we are in another bad phase now. And what is needed in there are bridge builders. And the tragedy, I think, of Brexit is that Britain has weakened itself as a bridge builder between the United States and the rest of Europe. A big part of the strategy of post-Brexit Britain will, I think, be restoring our ability to be a bridge builder even while we are outside the European Union. I've always thought that basically we were going to change the metaphor to a sailing metaphor. We would sail away from Europe, probably even a little too far away, and then we would gradually sail back, because the logic of our geography and our economy is that we should be close to Europe, and I think that's probably what's going to happen. Will it mean the breakup of the United Kingdom? I know some of you may well be interested in that. I now live much of my time in Dublin, though I retain a base in Oxford. The fate of Northern Ireland is an important part of the Brexit issue. I would say that the prospect of a united Ireland, of Northern Ireland joining the Republic, has increased as a result of this deal and of the whole process, and it has even been facilitated by the sort of deal that Boris Johnson has just done. However, I would say that there are many decades before that can be a practical possibility because of the deep divisions inside the North. And I think that a big part of British policy and of Irish policy will be about managing those expectations and managing the tensions between the different communities inside Northern Ireland, and seeking to find, if you like, unity in the island of Ireland without actual political unity. Scotland is, I think, a likelier prospect to seek independence out of this process, and indeed I would be amazed if there is not a new independence referendum in Scotland within the next decade at most, but possibly even within the next 5 years. Their push is going to be faster and more vigorous, all depending on the politics of the time. Where does it lead us to end up? Well, I think we will discuss that over questions now, but of course I should leave it with the point that in transatlantic relations, in the stability of Brexit, in relationships within Europe, a very big variable in that process is what happens on this side of the Atlantic. And no doubt you will all tell me with equal confidence that you know what's going to happen. Thank you for doing so.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. There was more clarity in your remarks than I think any of us have obtained by reading the news today or in the past week, so thank you very much for that. And the main thrust of your remarks that you think Brexit will happen is consistent with, Tony Blair was quoted today, former Prime Minister of the UK, who, Labour Prime Minister, was a Remainer, he said, just get it done has turned into a highly effective but utterly false mantra. The Remain side is in danger of winning the process battle, but losing the battle for public opinion, such is the fatigue. And I think that's consistent with what you were saying. We do have plenty of time for questions. I think Bill's remarks were very comprehensive, but I'm sure that there are questions. We'll take a few at a time. When I call on you, please identify yourself and your professional affiliation, if any. We'll take 3 or 4 questions, give Bill a chance to answer those, then we'll come back for subsequent rounds. So, Paul.
So, Paul Watterson, Shoulder Law in New York. New York and London law firm, I should say, not Dublin. One thing you didn't mention was how this affects the Liberals and the new fourth party, I guess they are, in the next election, if at all.
Okay.
Where does, many of them are Remainers. Does this enhance their electoral success when there is a general election, or is it still down to Jeremy versus Boris?
Okay. Peter.
There seems to be a great fear, Peter Pettibone, an independent arbitrator, mediator, a great fear in Britain about a trade agreement with the United States, much of which has to do with the types of products that may be brought into the UK from the United States. Can you explain more about that? Why this fear is there?
Klaus.
Klaus Müller, journalist and former professor. Bill, I'd just like you to talk about the economic consequences for Britain of Brexit. That's all I have to say. No statement on that.
Simple.
and Wendy, and I will go to the back, but Wendy.
Wendy Gerber, CEO of the International Consulting Group. 2 questions, and this was great. Thank you. The first one is, I've been to numerous conferences on Brexit, and I agree with Rick that what you said provided greater clarity than I've heard elsewhere. But for law firms and other firms that are really trying to advise their clients on new procedures, et cetera, there's so much of murky waters right now. At what point do you think there will be clarity in terms of being able to advise people? And secondarily, this vote was such a shock, as was the vote of Donald Trump. And what geopolitical forces do you feel led to this? And what are the ramifications that are still in play today?
So let's take one more. Bruce.
Hi, Bruce Peterson. I guess I'm unaffiliated with anyone. My question is, you spent a little bit of time talking about security and defense issues. To what extent should we think about that in terms of this vote and the separation? To what extent is it really all going to be dictated by aligned self-interest of European Union and the United States, which have had somewhat of an aligned self-interest?
So that's plenty of fodder for now. We'll come back for a second round for those who I haven't been able to get to. But Bill.
Okay. Well, I'll take them in order. I think that we will get some organizing for a time of British politics still around the issue of pro-Europe or pro-separation. And that means that there is a political opportunity for parties that can brand themselves as being in favor of a closer relationship with Europe, and possibly even of rejoining Europe. It's not clear that the rejoining brand will be strong at first. So if there were an election soon, I think the Liberal Democrats would prosper compared with the low base that they start at, but they probably wouldn't really sweep through. But it may be that as an organizing principle will become more powerful depending on how the negotiations proceed. Second part of that, I think we had seen until the 2017 election a steady breakup of Britain's two-party system, a fragmentation of the vote, election by election by election, because of regional parties especially, then also because of some single special issue parties, including the Green Party. 2017 produced an abrupt reversal of that, as Labour somehow branded itself as the kind of anti-austerity but also pro-Remain party. That, I think, is gone. So I think we'll see a return to fragmentation. I suspect that in the immediate environment, the Get Brexit Done party, the Conservatives will still be able to get an absolute majority, but we will see then a new fragmentation in the system. So where that leads to in 5 years' time, of course, is a different question. Now, the economic consequences and some of the trade issues, I think, are connected. Basically, the economic consequences, of course, do depend on our future trading relationship with the European Union. There's no doubt, as an economist, that if you simply say everything else stays the same except you raise the barriers for your trade with your biggest partner, your biggest market, and 60% of Britain's, the UK's trade is with the European Union, then that is going to have negative economic consequences. But the difficulty in answering the question is the fact that that isn't the only thing that's going to happen. Out of the things that will determine Britain's economic future, there are probably 5 or 6 different things, including the tax policy, including regulatory policy, including what happens to the global economy, probably including our kind of social policy and investment in education and infrastructure and all these other things. And Brexit, in other words, relationships with Europe, is only one of them. So that's why there isn't a clear economic consequences. If hold everything steady, definitely it's negative. The British Finance Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, refused to put an economic evaluation on the impact of the withdrawal agreement, precisely because the only possible formal evaluation is that it's negative and that it will cost British economy money. So voting for it looks like self-harm, and it is self-harm. But the problem politically is that there are other policies that will also have make a big difference, including then our trade relationships with other countries in the world. Those trade agreements will not compensate for difficult relationships with our biggest trading partner, and so the key negotiations will be between Britain and the European and the 27 countries of the European Union. And where that ends up, it is hard to predict. But we can also do trade deals with some countries such as the United States, and the US issue, the US trade issue, has become combined with 2 other issues. One is your view of Donald Trump and the Trump administration's trade policy and its behavior. And secondly, your view of deregulation. So the worries about the sort of trade deal we might deal with the US are generally worries that are also worries about deregulation of particularly food standards, which is why chlorinated chicken is, if you like, the headline issue, but also genetic engineering and other like phytosanitary issues. So where British policy ends up on those issues is going to be affected by the negotiations with the United States, but will mainly be determined in the UK about what kind of regulatory environment we want to have. The current Conservative government, including the minister who until recently was directly involved with this issue, Michael Gove, they constantly say that actually they want to have higher environmental, phytosanitary and other standards than the European Union, not lower. This seems incompatible with the notion that you will somehow deregulate and stimulate new economic activity as a result. But we will wait to see about that. A particularly incendiary political issue in Britain is the status of our public health system, of the National Health Service, in that it is basically a kind of the third rail of British politics. Touch it and it is a disaster. And a big issue in our the negotiating stance with the United States will be whether or not there will be any concession about, if you like, public procurement or public the buying and selling arrangements around the National Health Service. So that is also another part of the political worry about this. But frankly, I don't think it's a very serious issue because this trade negotiation with the US is going to take many years. We actually have no idea who our trading partner will be. No doubt you will tell me whether or not it's going to be the Trump 2, whether Robert Lighthizer will still be US trade representative and so forth. But I don't think we can form British policy based on speculation about the British election. So I think the American election. So I think it's very unclear.
Thank you.
As far as, but that's a lot of the reason why. I guess what led to this, I think the 2008 financial crisis basically led to this. In other words, it led to a volatility in politics and an anger at the establishment of all parties, a discrediting of mainstream parties, which led to pressure on a Prime Minister, David Cameron, to concede to his extremists in his party, because of a new party rising outside, for a referendum, which then led to the result that happened. The result that happened was incredibly close. The stupidity, in a way, from my point of view, was holding the referendum in the first place. In other words, you gave the possibility that this political force could lead to a major constitutional and strategic change of direction. Why then did we vote 52.1% in favour? So very close. Was it 51.9? Anyway, a very narrow thing. Essentially because the British public, too much of it, was indifferent about the European Union. So voting was subject to the vagaries of events at the time and of political fears and hopes at the time. There's a passionate anti-group. There's a small, passionate pro-group. The passionate anti-group just had a stronger campaign, but the large part of the British population essentially were indifferent. It wasn't an important issue to them, and therefore their vote was a bit of a toss-up. But because the origin was essentially the worst financial crisis since 1929. What do we expect when we have such big financial crises? We should have things like that. So final one I should get to is the security and defence question. Can you ask it again, actually? From what
I was just wondering if it was, whether events, whether the security and defense issue was mostly going to be determined by how these various parties view their self-interests and their alignments, and whether the vote really mattered very much to that, or the separation from Europe really mattered for that at all.
Well, I think that basically the interest alignments mean that we would be likely to be Britain would be likely to be continuing to cooperate pretty closely with European partners, who are of course important within NATO, especially France. We're intensively collaborating with the French military. So the big fear is that the poison of the negotiation might interrupt a natural alignment. Now, there's a British political reluctance to entertain any idea of a European army and a European defence force, and that is because of a matter of control and a sort of a sense that this would take blood and treasure away from British control. But that's not really on the table. I think that, and certainly not as non-members, so I think we can just resume a strategic collaboration with each other while we have some different foreign policy stances. As I said, in terms of Russia, Ukraine, Iran, probably a lot of Middle East and North African issues, and arguably even China, our interests are very aligned. So I would say that absent Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, we will not diverge very, very substantially on this, because it would be crazy to do so.
So I'm going to kick off the second round, because many of us, Bill, here work in the financial markets, and one of the questions that we have is, what is the future of London, in your view, as the financial capital of Europe and as a global financial center? So we'd be interested in your views on that. Starting from the back, Ed.
Ed Papagenio Prudential, thank you very much. But what you described is a severely weakened United Kingdom. In fact, one would ask whether it is a United Kingdom anymore. So for economic purposes, you more or less carved off Northern Ireland. We know that Scotland has been restive. What would you be able to offer to the European Union in your negotiations besides the size of your market? That's half of the question. The other half of the question is, I can't tell you what's going to happen here, but right now we, the United States, a very unreliable a partner in terms of trade policy and foreign policy. And you said that you will be talking with us, so, I mean, it's over a year that I guess we'll be fiddling around not knowing what the future holds, and then after that, there's going to be some readjustment. So, again, how is that going to, my subtext is that you're going to be severely handicapped in your negotiations with the EU.
Bruce Bennett.
Yeah, Bruce.
Related question. Comprehensive trade deals don't get negotiated in 2 years. What will happen at the end of that 2-year period, assuming the deal is structured holds? There's no trade agreement. Do we effectively then have a no-deal Brexit because there's nothing in place?
What happens during that 2-year period if there really is a lot of similar reaction from other jurisdictions, other states, talking about also having their own exit? What's the dynamic on the negotiations over that 2 years?
Mark.
I want to cheer you up a little bit. Sometimes the misfortunes of others can make one happier.
Just name and
Mark Rickle, Clear Markets Holdings. Brexit, sorry, the financial crisis brought you Brexit. It brought us the Dodd-Frank Act.
Yes.
So I don't think you're faring too badly so far. And here's one reason I say that. You've said that it might be self-harm for the UK to impose greater friction in its trading relationship with Europe. If that's true, would the same not also be true for Europe? And isn't it within Europe's ability to bring the level of friction in trade right back down to where it is today or even below that? And why would they not?
Okay, great questions. Bill.
Yeah. So first of all, the city. Well, I think the city of London is a famously flexible and innovative financial centre. It will, though, it is losing and will lose some parts of its business, namely those that relied on being directly a part of the European Union. Those are not, however, the heart of the city. The heart of the city is a wholesale business, essentially, and one that actually has often flourished by not being the non-regulated partner in all sorts of places, has it not? So I think the city will reform itself. It will take a smaller base. A lot of companies have already moved parts of their operations out of the city. But nevertheless, London, I think, will remain a major financial centre. There's a hell of a lot of inertia there, basically, and because also of the critical mass factor of employment. I doubt if we will actually kill the city. So this comes down to the sort of amount of friction in our trading relationships, actually. You're right that there isn't a direct European interest in imposing friction on trade with the sixth biggest economy in the world, but we are relatively, the cost of friction with us is much smaller for a 27-country economic zone of by then 430 million people than it is for a single country of 70 million people. So that the frictional costs are much more on our side. How much friction depends on how much deregulation we want to do. Essentially, the issues of trade these days are all about regulations. They're not about tariffs. And that's in services like finance, and in goods, I cannot but assume that actually there will be a tremendous pull on both sides to minimize the divergence. But I think that some sectors in Britain will successfully lobby for quite substantial divergence. But I'm not an advocate of this, but I suspect that in order to get some sort of trade deal through within the transition period, that actually the amount of immediate divergence will be quite low. In other words, restricted to only a sector or two. And that then makes it easier to do the impossible of doing such a comprehensive deal in a short amount of time, because we are all, the status quo is that we are using a common set of rules. So if we copy and paste a lot of those rules and say we're just going to continue with those, then that should be doable in a relatively short time. The problem is then having to agree legal language and treaty language that governs a subsequent desire to diverge, and that manages what happens when a future government in Britain decides that it's going to diverge in certain sectors. Can you really have mutual recognition arrangements that govern that? So it is going to be complicated, but the amount of friction that we put in our trade will depend depend on the motivation to get the deal done quickly, I suppose is a way to put it. I don't think that there's ever really been a great political desire for no deal, for a chaotic, unregulated exit, because the core of the Conservative Party, even the core of the very pro-Brexit parts of the Conservative Party, realise that actually no deal is not an end. It's the beginning of a new negotiation about new regulatory arrangements with each other, and you're just making it more difficult to do that. So what I think that the pro-Brexit forces will want to do is to try to establish a sort of a steady state as quickly as possible, and then gradually feel its way towards divergence in certain sectors, rather than, as it were, seeking to go for maximum disruption at first and then claw back. Yes, this will be a weakened UK. It already is weakened, I think, diplomatically and in its reputation. It will be disadvantaged economically. I've tried to explain that you can't say how bad it is going to be disadvantaged, because there are many other factors involved. Our performance in the period since Brexit is that we have fallen a bit below the European Union performance, but not much. Actually, one of the reasons why the politics of opposing Brexit have not taken fire is actually because we're at full employment. People don't feel that bad about the process, even though we have statistically deteriorated. So we're a bit weakened, but we're not crippled. You're right, the United States is an unreliable partner. That's true for Japan, it's true for Germany, it's true for the UK, it's true for everybody who has had alliances with and a sense of reliance on the US. But I think, so it's not an alternative, like solid node of policy for Britain, but I think that the British political and foreign policy establishment understand that quite well. I think that they've known that the current degree of unreliability is rather greater than was the case before, but it's not a complete change. And that the degree of new weakness or new unreliability perhaps can be expected to reduce in the future rather than increase. We just don't know quite how far that's going to go. In terms of the dynamic of the negotiation, I think it's pretty clear that in this negotiating period, there aren't any other countries in Europe in which the politics is pressing towards exit. There are countries that are more or less favourable to the EU. There are countries in which some of the politics of treating Brussels and the European Union as the enemy have some attractions, but there aren't any countries where calling for exit, either from the euro single currency or from the European Union as a whole, is proving to be an election winner. It hasn't even really got any parties really a substantial point in the polls. And I would point to Italy, a country I spent quite a lot of time studying and in, as a case in point of that. More than 1 year ago, there was a general election. Two quite anti-establishment parties prevailed and formed a coalition. Both of them dropped their anti-Europe stances, in other words, their exit stances. It turned into a more negotiating relationship. Now, the most anti-European party, the League, has indeed been ejected from the coalition, and now it's a pro-European coalition. So I don't think that really this arrangement is going to be characterized by a contamination across Europe. Europe has its own problems of dysfunctionality and difficulty of decisions, but exit is not actually going to be one of them in this time frame anyway. 10 years' time, anyone can guess about that, but right now it's not, I think, an important issue. Did I answer all of those questions? Possibly.
I think so. So let's take one or two more quick questions. Sarah, and then Kevin.
Sarah, particularly with HSBC, but my own question is that you mentioned that the financial crisis was the catalyst for all these things that happened, but financial crisis, the 2008, is just the symptom. Could you talk more about the root causes?
And sorry, Dave. Last question, Kevin. Sorry.
Hey, Kevin O'Reilly. Two quick questions. First of all, you haven't touched on immigration, which really was what Brexit was about. It wasn't about 2008. Yes,
I disagree, but I'll politely do so in a second.
Okay.
When you do so, you talk about U.S. foreign policy in North Africa forcing the issue.
Okay.
Merkel announced yesterday the end of German multiculturalism, which amounted to German amusement. But, I mean, that's the biggest issue Europe faced. Brexit, I think, was a manifestation of that concern for the British. And then secondly, what does Vladimir Putin think about all this? Because for a guy with a shitty economy, he's playing a world hand like nobody's business, and this must factor into his calculations.
And David, since you started your question, go ahead and finish it.
Well, just that the U.S. foreign policy towards the Levant, going back for the last 20 years, has been, we've had regicide with the taking out Gaddafi, we've had the Syrian debacle, which again covered two administrations. So rather than make it a Trump issue, I say U.S. foreign policy last 20 years, and what that's done across the Levant, forcing populations north, and the impact it's had throughout Europe with this emphasis on Brexit.
So that's a lot for Bill to cover in the last 2 minutes, but I'm sure he's up to it.
I've got as much as 2 minutes, have I? Right. Okay, well, I agree that basically I want you to buy my book. It's called The Fate of the West. It's available in all good bookstores and on Amazon. It is basically about how the 2008 financial crisis was the result of a long-term set of trends towards essentially the corruption of politics in the liberal democracies of the West, and it is a natural part of, I'm afraid, the processes of democracy, but thanks to, if you like, the great moderation and a very benign set of economic circumstances from the mid-1990s until the mid-2000s, that then led to, I think, a complacency that did then lead to the extremes that produced the 2008 crash. But the fact is that the stress of the 2008 crash, mitigated to some degree by obviously central bank and fiscal policy, but not, I'm afraid, eliminated, are the reasons why you get a very angry reaction and why mainstream solutions lost credibility. So I absolutely stand by that. Immigration versus that, I think anger about immigration was substantially basically a reflection of the 2008 crash. Why are people angry about immigrants in the United Kingdom, where we get no one from North Africa, basically? We've got no refugees. I mean, I exaggerate with the word no, but I mean a tiny number of refugees. It's nothing to do with that issue. It's all to do with Poles and Italians and Spanish and Lithuanians coming and working in Britain. Why? Because I think...
immigration, isn't it?
Yes, it's immigration.
I
But
don't necessarily agree with the view of the British people, I'm just telling you that.
No, I know.
If you talk to any Brexiteer...
I know all the opinion polls, don't worry.
But it's not, the polls are like these minor sort of things. If you talk to anybody who actually voted for Brexit, first of all, they don't know why they voted for it. And then secondly, the next words out of their mouth, they mumble something about immigration.
Yes, no, I mean, of course, of the many issues that motivated people to vote, which were, as you say, not necessarily particularly about the European Union, immigration is the single largest common factor. That's absolutely right. And as a fear factor in the campaign, immigration was the most powerful one. Why is immigration so powerful? Well, everywhere it's powerful. It's powerful in this country, it's powerful in Italy. It's powerful particularly because of economic reasons, but also cultural ones. And it's about the pace of immigration and so forth. So, I mean, absolutely, the desire to control immigration is important. The paradox of our current situation is that our Prime Minister in Britain, Mr. Boris Johnson, is himself a product of an immigrant family. He stood as Mayor of London on a cosmopolitanism, pro-immigration stance, and he has already reversed some of the anti-immigration policies of his predecessor. So he is, I think, taking the view, which may or may not be proved to be true, that he can gamble on being more liberal on immigration than before, perhaps because we've now left the European Union, and therefore it is thought to be, as it were, within our policy control, rather than being part of a membership of the European Union. So I mean, I agree with you, it's a very salient issue, but it's not the reason why we had the referendum in the first place. The reason for that is the political stress caused by 2008. So that's the division. I think we agree, and kind of it's just a matter of emphasis. I mean, I agree. Now, the role of US foreign policy in North Africa, well, all I'll just say is that David Cameron was in favour of removing Gaddafi, and Britain and France were instrumental in what happened in Libya. Indeed, famously, President Obama was leading from behind in that very policy. So this is a European policy with American characteristics, rather than it being something we should just blame on America. So I mean, yes, the instability of the Middle East and particularly what's happening in Syria, probably we can take more as a foreign policy consequence. But I think we're all part of that story. This is what I want to say. What does Putin think? Well, Putin is running a kleptocratic regime, very successfully using money as power, and he has rebuilt Russia's status as a player in geopolitics very successfully. He doesn't like other countries' rivals to be strong, and therefore he likes the weakening of the European Union. And he likes the fact that the UK has been detached from the European Union. He thinks it and the election of Donald Trump and the discrediting of American democracy have created extra strategic space for him. But in the end, he's playing a very weakened hand well, but the reality is the weakened hand. Personally, China, to me, is a bigger issue than Vladimir Putin.
Well, before I ask you to thank our speaker, we're going to bring this to a close now, but two quick housekeeping notes. I mentioned the November 5th event. I'm not hosting it, so those of you who are typically invited by me will not hear from me. But if you're interested, it's going to be on the state of the U.S. military. 5 U.S. military officers who are Council on Foreign Relations fellows. See Lee Sloan about that event if you'd like to attend that event. Also, see Lee or me if you're interested in joining the IISS. I hope many of you have joined. I hope more of you will join. And finally, as I said at the beginning, Bill does have some time, and he will stick around to answer those questions that I was not able to get to. So now it just remains for me to say that I'm very, very pleased that you joined us tonight, Bill, and that you continue to bring insight the sort of insight that you brought to your work at The Economist, both as a journalist and as an editor, that you continue to bring tremendous insight into issues that we find very, very challenging. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking them.